Hi folks, my name is Phil and welcome to Grounded, the series which looks at airlines of yesteryear. Our last two episodes covered the Cypriot charter airlines of Cypriot and Helios. This episode will take a look at the island's third charter airline, KTHY. In 1974, the island of Cyprus was an up-and-coming tourist destination. With beautiful beaches and perfectly clear blue seas, the island was on the up and up. Unfortunately, the island was also in the midst of a power struggle, a result of its recent independence from British rule. Following a Greek-led coup d'etat which ultimately failed, there were two Turkish invasions under the auspices of protecting the relatively small Turkish population on the island. Following a ceasefire between the two sides, the United Nations established a buffer zone which bisected the island and divided it into the occupied north and the free south, with the south being the Republic of Cyprus. The north of the island, however, is still under Turkey's continued illegal occupation and as a result is only recognised as a country by Turkey. This presented a number of challenges to both the people who live there and any potential tourists, and thus KTHY was born. KTHY, or Kibris Türk Hava Yollari, is Turkish for Cyprus Turkish Airlines and was established as the flag carrier of North Cyprus during the summer of 1974. Ownership of the new airline was split equally between the Turkish flag carrier, Turkish Airlines, and the de facto government of the North Cyprus state. The airline would initially have offices in Nicosia, the island's capital. Interestingly, Nicosia is still divided, with the buffer zone running through the city, with it getting very narrow in some spaces, just down to a few feet between the north and south. Nicosia is the only remaining divided capital city in the world. On a personal note, I visited in 2002 and I was awestruck by the seemingly abandoned buildings right by the buffer zone. There was one mechanic's workshop with old cars still parked inside and covered in dust. The mechanic, seemingly one of the thousands of Greek Cypriots that disappeared following the invasion. Nicosia International Airport to the west of the capital was the scene of intense fighting during the conflict, and following the establishment of the buffer zone, the airport was closed to all traffic and became the home to the UN peacekeeping forces, which are still on the island to this day, nearly 50 years later. Interestingly, there is still a Cyprus Airways Hawker Siddeley Trident parked on the ramp there, the aircraft having been trapped during the fighting and now looted of anything of value. There's also the wreckage of a Czechoslovakian Tupoloev which had overran the runway the year before the invasion. With Nicosia Airport out of action, the Republic of Cyprus hastily built a new airport at Larnaca and would also build a new airport at Paphos a few years later. The occupied north would build an airport at Erkan, a former British Royal Air Force base from World War II located just to the east of Nicosia. Erkan would open in early 1975 using the old RAF runway, with a newly constructed runway seeing use from early 1976. KTHY would initially use aircraft hired from Turkish Airlines, including the Boeing 727 and Douglas DC-9. The airline's first destinations were Adana, Ankara and Istanbul, all within Turkey. Services to London were advertised, however, these required transferring to a Turkish Airlines aircraft in Istanbul. Herein lied the problem, not just for KTHY but any airline planning to fly from Erkan. Only Turkey recognised, and continues to recognise, the legitimacy of North Cyprus as a state. Because of this, international flights to the occupied territory were banned. They would have to land in mainland Turkey first. Another result of this was that while KTHY was headquartered in and ran from Nicosia, it was registered as a company in Istanbul in order to gain licences to operate internationally. The summer of 1977 would see KTHY get its own metal, of sorts, with the airline leasing a Boeing 720 from AeroAmerica. The story of the interesting airline that is AeroAmerica is best left for another day, however. The aircraft would stay with KTHY until the start of 1980 and wore a hybrid livery consisting of one of AeroAmerica's various schemes complete with KTHY titles and tail logo. AeroAmerica would send one more 720 to KTHY in January 1978 for a month in order to cover for the other one which had suffered a hard landing and was undergoing maintenance. Turkish Airlines would lease KTHY a DC-9 from February 1979 with the aircraft wearing Turkish Airlines livery and KTHY titles and branding. The DC-9 would return to Turkish Airlines in the summer of 1981 and leave the airline without any aircraft. The fact that KTHY was now an airline without a fleet didn't stop them, as they would continue to charter flights from Turkish Airlines, leaving them pretty much as what we would consider a paper airline these days. By 1983, KTHY had expanded its international route network, with the airline now offering flights to Frankfurt, Jeddah, Milan, Munich, Vienna and Zurich. Again, all of these flights were routed via the mainland, with the international sector being operated by Turkish Airlines. In reality, the whole shebang was operated by Turkish Airlines, with the KTHY flight numbers being used on the domestic flights between the mainland and Erkan. The KTHY charade would continue on throughout the 1980s, with the airline's flights being operated by Turkish Airlines. Turkish, whose acronym is THY, is not being used here as it will get terribly confusing. Turkish Airlines would continue to operate KTHY flights with their Boeing 727 and Douglas DC-9, but would also introduce the Airbus A310 widebody. The A310 would be used on a number of international routes as well as the domestic sector from the mainland to Erkan. KTHY would gradually expand its international route network each year. By 1988, destinations included Amsterdam, Belgrade, Copenhagen and Rome. More changes were coming, changes which would see KTHY actually become a fully fledged airline. In the spring of 1990, KTHY acquired a Boeing 727-200, the airline's first aircraft of its own. Naturally, this aircraft came second-hand from Turkish Airlines. In fact, it would spend its first year being operated by Turkish Airlines crews, as KTHY didn't yet have any pilots nor cabin crew. A second 727 was also purchased by the airline but remained with Turkish Airlines. The aircraft would be transferred to KTHY a couple of years later. With the arrival of their own aircraft, it meant time for an actual livery. Their first livery was nothing to get excited about. It was a white fuselage and tail with a grey belly. The words Cyprus Turkish Airlines were on the forward fuselage and KTHY towards the aft. The company logo featured on the tail. As KTHY developed into a fully fledged airline, first with its own aircraft and then hiring its own crews, KTHY's route network developed further too. KTHY would begin flights to Stuttgart, Geneva, Brussels and Paris. The airline would also begin to operate its own flights to London, taking over from Turkish Airlines. Turkish would also continue to operate another 727 on behalf of the airline, with it wearing KTHY titles alongside its own Turkish Airlines branding. By 1993, the airline had a fleet of 3 Boeing 727s, plus one additional one operated on their behalf by Turkish Airlines. In March 1994, an Airbus A310-200 would join the KTHY fleet. The widebody jet was leased from Lufthansa ahead of the airline taking delivery of its own aircraft. This A310 would leave in November, with it being replaced by KTHY's own Airbus the following month. This aircraft would be second-hand, having been acquired from Air France. The following year, in 1995, KTHY drafted in the fly-by-wire Airbus A320, with the airline subchartering one from Adria Airways, the flag carrier of Slovenia. While this aircraft would wear the KTHY white livery and branding, it would find itself operating Adria flights during its spare time. The A320 wasn't the only addition, however. KTHY brought in a further Boeing 727, this one from Holiday Airlines, a short-lived Turkish charter airline. A Boeing 737-200 would also join the fleet. This one was built in 1970 and was rather well travelled, having seen service with a number of operators since then. It was hired from MAT Macedonian Airlines and would stay until the following spring. The much more interesting of that year's additions was a single Tupolev Tu-154 which was leased from Vnukovo Airlines. The Tupolev would wear the Vnukovo livery with the addition of KTHY titles on the fuselage and their logo squeezed into a small part of the tail. Interestingly, while this aircraft was on lease to another Turkish charter airline, Active Air, it overran the runway in Maastricht, coming within feet of a power distribution box and gas line. It was repaired and returned to KTHY, who returned it to Vnukovo shortly afterwards. By 1996, the A320 had gone back to Adria Airways and KTHY took delivery of its second Airbus A310. The widebodies were being used primarily on the flights between the Turkish mainland and Erkan, as well as other high-traffic routes such as London and Paris. The year would also see KTHY order its first brand new aircraft straight from the manufacturer. The airline placed an order for 3 McDonnell Douglas MD-90s with an option for a further 3. Deliveries were to start in the spring of 1997. In the meantime, KTHY would acquire a further Airbus A310. This one had previously been with Wardair of Canada and more recently Sudan Airways. To coincide with the arrival of their first brand new aircraft, KTHY revised their livery. Their aircraft would sport a white fuselage with large blue KTHY titles towards the front. The tail was now painted dark blue with the KTHY logo still featuring prominently in the centre. The first 2 MD-90s arrived in March 1997. Their time with the company would be short, however, as the 2 were returned to the manufacturer by the end of the year. The company had claimed an unsatisfactory performance from the type. They couldn't have been that bad though, as Turkish Airlines, who owned 50% of KTHY, acquired both aircraft a few months later. Incidentally, one of these would later see service with British Jet via Hello Airlines for today's cheeky episode shoutout. In reality, KTHY had failed to keep up with the lease fees for the aircraft and both had been repossessed by McDonnell Douglas after the manufacturer's grace period had ended. The third aircraft, which was to become TC-KTC, was painted up and ready for delivery but would instead be sold to another operator. It is seen here in storage awaiting its fate. Incidentally, the registration used by Douglas, November 6204 Charlie, was later assigned to a Boeing 717, which also found itself in limbo. In the case of that one, its future airline, Spanair Link, cancelled their order with the aircraft already painted and ready to be delivered. Just thought I'd mention that coincidence. With the MD-90s returned and the airline's options on the other 3 cancelled, KTHY found itself short of metal once again. A 4th and final Boeing 727 would join the fleet during the year, leaving the KTHY fleet at 7 aircraft, 4 727s and 3 A310s. 3 more destinations were added to the route network, with Budapest, Dusseldorf and London Stansted now seeing regular service from the airline, again all served via the Turkish mainland. The new Millenneum saw KTHY sign a deal for the Boeing 737-800 next generation aircraft, with the airline ordering 2 of the type from Boeing to be delivered in April 2000. KTHY started serving new destinations too, with Glasgow and Ostend seeing service. The airline also operated a number of ad hoc charter flights, with its small fleet being put to good use. KTHY's fleet of Boeing 727s were getting rather old by the early 2000s. They were in need of various upgrades, such as new hush kits to keep them legal to fly in Europe, as well as heavy maintenance work that goes on with keeping old birds flying. Planning for their retirement, KTHY picked up a 3rd Boeing 737 in May 2001. The Trijets would soldier on for another year until they were withdrawn at the end of the 2002 summer season. Following the departure of the 727 fleet, KTHY would find itself short on capacity yet again, and thus the airline would have to hire aircraft from other operators. A single McDonnell Douglas MD-82 was brought in from September 2003 until 2004. This aircraft retained the livery of its operator, Jet Africa of Swaziland, now known as Eswatini as of 2018, and certainly brightened up the airports it visited during its stay with KTHY. The Mad Dog would be returned in May 2004, though another one would be drafted in a year later. This time it would wear the full KTHY livery, just like its distant cousins, those previously returned MD-90s. 2004 would also see KTHY introduce the Airbus A321 to its fleet, with the airline picking up 3 aircraft. One was a former Sabina example, and the second was from the recently liquidated Volair Airlines of Italy. The third one was brand new, however. It had been ordered by MyTravel Airways, but the British charter airline had to cancel the order as it was going through severe financial trouble at the time. Incidentally, following its time with KTHY, this Airbus found its way to Ural Airlines, where it would crash land in a cornfield after suffering dual engine failure due to multiple bird strikes when leaving Moscow. Miraculously, everyone on board survived the forced landing, though the aircraft would be written off. KTHY's wide-body fleet was gradually reduced during this time, with just a single Airbus A310 remaining during 2004. It would be withdrawn the following summer, leaving KTHY as a pure narrow-body airline. One Airbus A321 would be withdrawn in 2007 as the airline saw a drop in traffic and needed to cut capacity. This dip was short-term, however, and an additional Boeing 737-800 would join the fleet in 2009. KTHY would also lease a single Airbus A320 from Turquoise Airlines as the airline had now found itself yet again short on metal. The fleet now stood at 4 Boeing 737s and 2 Airbus A321s, as well as the hired-in Airbus A320. The arrival of the new 737 coincided with the reveal of a new livery for the airline. The fuselage would still predominantly be white, however, there was now a dark blue belly which swept up onto the tail of the aircraft. The KTHY logo would still feature prominently on the tail as before, however, the KTHY name was dropped from the aircraft. Instead, the name Cyprus Turkish would feature on the fuselage over the forward cabin windows. Only the newly delivered 737 would sport this full livery, however. The other 737s would receive the new titles but retain their white bellies. The 2 Airbus A321s wouldn't even get that. Instead, they would retain their full KTHY livery and branding. By 2010, KTHY was in a terrible financial state. The airline had been struggling for a number of years. However, as it was part state-owned until 2005, it was able to hang on in there, with the airline seen as a part lifeline and part vanity project for the North Cyprus authorities. The harsh reality of part privatisation, combined with the world economic crisis, began to take its toll on the airline, however. The busy summer season was approaching fast, and the airline found itself unable to operate some aircraft for fear of repossession. Reportedly, at least 2 of the 737 fleet were to be impounded should they land in the United Kingdom. Turkish Technic, KTHY's maintenance provider, called in a long-standing debt of $12 million and impounded 2 aircraft, having placed liens on them and further adding to the airline's woes. It was reported that with KTHY having debts totaling close to $120 million, that the airline had just a few weeks' worth of cash available, with their credit card companies withholding funds and staff going unpaid. KTHY desperately sought rescue from anywhere. With Turkey not being in the European Union, it could have been eligible for state aid, but that wasn't forthcoming. 2 airlines had been interested in KTHY, Pegasus Airlines and Atlas Jet. The approach from Pegasus was rebuffed, leaving Atlas Jet as their only hope. As this was going on the 21st of June 2010, the Turkish Civil Aviation Authority pulled KTHY's operating licenses, leaving the airline's fleet grounded. This wasn't quite the end though. KTHY and Atlas Jet managed to work out a 50-50 profit-sharing deal, and in an effort to keep KTHY somewhat solvent, Atlas Jet would operate various flights on behalf of KTHY, as well as honour existing ticket holders onto Atlas Jet flights. Despite a deal being agreed in principle, there were still too many hurdles to overcome. In particular, the opposition to KTHY's privatisation by various political parties and the lack of concessions from some trade unions associated with the carrier. In the end, the deal would collapse, as according to an Atlas Jet statement, "It is crystal clear that it will not be possible for us to strike a deal with one-sided goodwill at a time when workers do not stand in solidarity with us. As such, a crisis can only be overcome through cooperation of workers and administrators." With the rescue deal now in tatters, its operating licenses revoked, most of its fleet impounded, and the company heavily in debt with no way out, KTHY was grounded, permanently. So, what went wrong? For the first few years of their existence, KTHY were nothing more than a glorified paper airline. They had no aircraft, no crew, and for the first couple of years no ground staff, with everything being covered by Turkish Airlines. When KTHY eventually got their own aircraft and personnel, they became a legitimate airline, however, one that faced a problem that no other airline in the world faced. North Cyprus was, and still is, not recognised internationally as a legitimate state, apart from by Turkey, of course. A direct result of this is that there can be no direct flights between North Cyprus and any foreign country. In order to get around this, all KTHY flights would stop off on the Turkish mainland, either to change aircraft, as was in the case of the early years, or just for a quick tech stop. Flights would be routed through Adana, Antalya, Danalab, Istanbul, Izmir, and Gaziantep, depending on their ultimate destination, of course. If you recall the Eurocypria episode, that airline struggled to turn a profit due to their low aircraft utilisation, itself a direct result of the lengthy flight times to and from Cyprus. How on earth could KTHY be profitable with the added pit stop en route? One side effect of these forced tech stops was an increase in costs. More fuel was consumed, extra runway fees and longer working hours for the crews, thus more in wages amongst other things. It could also be argued that the entire situation with the occupation would have put quite a few potential travellers off. To be fair, there wasn't exactly a mass of promotional material from the North Cyprus Tourist Board trying to entice holidaymakers into visiting. KTHY did have its own holiday division, CTA Holidays, for KTHY liked to abbreviate itself as CTA or Cyprus Turkish Airlines most of the time. KTHY would rely on independent travel agents to push their package holidays and in the later years also promote them on the airline's website. You might wonder if they were under the cosh from competition. Well, no. KTHY had a near monopoly on flights from Erkan, with just Turkish Airlines operating on some routes to the mainland. Following their demise, other carriers operate to Erkan, but they're all from the mainland and have much larger route networks, something that KTHY was always going to struggle with thanks to the forced tech stops. KTHY did try to operate direct flights from Erkan, with the airline applying for permission to operate several routes direct to the UK in the mid-2000s, but this request was denied by the United Kingdom government. While KTHY's hands were clearly tied on the route front, they didn't help themselves with their mixed fleet. Until 2005, KTHY was part state-owned, and, as a vanity project, the cost of operating an eclectic fleet was largely covered by the government. Once partly privatised, the airline had to fend for itself. The wide-body fleet was withdrawn, but it still had a handful of 737s and A321s. Both fleets required separate parts, mechanics and pilots. In fact, the only commonality between the two would be the cabin crew who could operate on both types. This somewhat unnecessary duplication will continue to cost the airline money right up to the end. Unlike Eurocypria, which was forced into liquidation following the European Commission's ruling that state aid would be illegal, KTHY could have been rescued by the government. Since Turkey was not in the European Union, it didn't need to abide by their rules and thus could have bailed the airline out. While the government on both the mainland and in North Cyprus looked into a bailout, or even renationalising the airline, they decided against it and tried to force through a merger with another carrier. Even when the airline was at death's door, they saw a way out and actively avoided it. Various parties involved with the airline refused to make enough concessions, and as a result, Atlas Jet walked away from the deal. It's debatable how well things would have turned out had the deal gone through. Atlas Jet ceased operations a decade later in February 2020. The other airline that was interested but reportedly rebuffed without even having their offer looked at was Pegasus Airlines. They're still around and are currently the second largest airline in Turkey. KTHY was always destined to struggle. Like the North Cyprus flag that had been painted onto the side of Mount Pentadactylos overlooking Free Cyprus, KTHY was more of a political statement than an airline. It was simply another way for the Turkish government to attempt to legitimise their illegally occupied territory. Unlike the continued land dispute which looked set to go unresolved, at least the KTHY story did come to an end. Thanks for watching. If you have any comments, suggestions or criticisms, please do get in touch. If you don't have a YouTube doodah, don't worry, I've got a contact form on my website and I'm also on Facebook and Twitter. I have plenty more episodes in the works, so if you haven't already, why not subscribe to catch them as they land? And as always, thanks for watching.